Deliverance. 2 hours of pure Hollywood terror, making Jon Voight and Burt Reynolds household names.
Deliverance is a landmark picture. It was something that we hadn't really seen, and it was real.
While audience members are deeply affected by the film's brutality, one viewer watches the movie just 2 days before he decides to recreate it.
This wasn't just some crazed monster who came to town and committed a crime. This was somebody within our community that everybody revered and respected.
Like the canoe trip that starts out so innocently in Deliverance, this crime takes a deadly turn.
Mr. Fentress, what are you doing?
Shut up!
It's beyond anyone's imagination, the events that took place. I believe he was influenced by the movie a great deal, based upon the writings that he created and ultimately the acts that played out.
Like the movie Deliverance, with each bend of the river, there's a new tragedy in store.
This copycat crime is as haunting as the movie it's inspired by.
Nothing like this had ever happened in our town before. It was about as heinous as a crime can get.
In 1972, legendary actors Jon Voight and Burt Reynolds star in the landmark thriller Deliverance.
The movie was huge when it came out. It was so different from anything else. Burt Reynolds and Jon Voight stood out and became household names.
The film follows 4 friends who set out on a canoe trip in the rural mountains of northeast Georgia. But what starts out as an innocent ride down the river soon turns deadly.
It was one of the first movies to really show sexual assault where a male is the victim. The film allowed for audiences to think that in the backwoods anything can happen. It made people afraid to go into the woods.
The American Film Institute calls Deliverance one of the most thrilling movies of all time.
Deliverance won 3 Academy Awards and was nominated for 5 Golden Globe Awards. Burt Reynolds calls Deliverance the best movie that he's ever made.
Deliverance affected a lot of people very strongly.
For small-town schoolteacher Albert Fentress, Deliverance represents a motivation for murder.
When he saw Deliverance, something inside him opened his eyes. Could have been his worst fear, or possibly his greatest fantasy.
I believe that the combination of viewing the movie, coupled with the pranks that had been occurring over a period of time, kind of brought everything to a head.
Joe, a human being. Joe, a student.
Claiming that Fentress's attack was sparked by the movie Deliverance.
The ultimate actions that he took, according to him, were triggered by this movie.
Mild-mannered bachelor Albert Fentress is a popular middle school history teacher in the tiny town of Poughkeepsie, New York.
He was known as the most exciting, flamboyant, cool teacher in the school.
Albert's former student, Wayne Witherwax, remembers the popular teacher well.
He actually was a very good teacher. He was very engaging, very entertaining. He brought the history class, which is what I took him for, to life. He would come in dressed in costume.
And the battle raged for 2 days, each side exchanging volleys of lead.
That was what he lived for. He was very dedicated to his craft.
Although Albert lives on a teacher's salary, he's known to have expensive taste.
Albert wanted to be seen as a man that was successful.
He very much enjoyed a refined lifestyle. He always had a relatively new Lincoln Continental or Cadillac.
He also collected stamps. It's something that, in many ways, could be looked at as an intellectual hobby. So, no matter what, Albert wanted to be seen as a man of style and as a man that had an education and a man that was a contributing member to the community.
In the classroom, Albert's obsession with image takes center stage.
He dressed always very immaculately, not a hair out of place. The crease in his pants was so sharp that you would cut your finger on it if you ran it across it.
We see this many times from people who unconsciously feel that they are less than equal. And it's a way to say, without saying anything, I want to be accepted.
He viewed his things as an extension of himself.
Albert's need to be the best is noticed in his classroom.
They captured every single Confederate soldier.
Everything had to be perfect, that he had to be considered a really cool guy and all that. That was important to him. So I think anything that threatened that obviously would have been a problem for him.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the war was won.
But not every student is a fan of Albert.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow.
The students that were in the honors program welcomed his style of teaching because it really was engaging. But the non-honors classes, those students would take it, sort of tongue-in-cheek. They would, make fun of him, mock him to some degree. He was troubled by that.
See you later, guys.
Soon, rumors begin to circulate about Albert.
There were rumors that he was gay, going about the school.
There's many reasons as to why bullying starts. Albert was a bachelor living alone in a suburban neighborhood, and he was a school teacher. There may have been snide remarks mentioned. His behavior may have been scrutinized. They may have seen mannerisms or behaviors that they thought indicated that he was gay.
I believe his reaction to the rumors was that he tried to portray a different persona, that he was a macho individual, that he was a man's man.
Albert did date, and at one point was actually engaged to a woman and professed to all that knew him that he was heterosexual.
But the bullying from Albert's students doesn't stop and soon extends beyond the confines of the school.
They would send magazine subscriptions to his home that were, of course, unwanted. At one point, they wrote on his front lawn in weed killer. They started to write out derogatory remarks about him.
When school lets out, summer break only brings more hardships. Albert's home is broken into.
Albert had this stamp collection, and whether it was worth a lot of money or it wasn't worth a dime, it was a hobby that he spent long hours and time focused in on. And then it was stolen.
Yes, I just came home and discovered it. Somebody came into my home, it's ransacked, I think some of my stamps are stolen. I need help. Could you please send the police?
Which was very troubling to him because, again, part of his self-worth was tied into his belongings and his collections.
What was going on in Albert's mind when this was all going on? When these bullies were pushing his psychological buttons, what did that do to him?
As the summer progresses, the attacks against Albert only get worse.
Not only was his stamp collection taken, his house was egged, he got phone pranks, and his tires were slashed. So he felt persecuted, and he felt paranoid.
I think he perceived it as an attack on who he was and what he wanted everyone to perceive him to be. And he had no control over it. And he was very much a man who wanted to be in control.
Hey! Hey, you kid! Hey, get back here! Hey!
Did that make him start to self-examine himself? Or did it make him look at his environment and say, how can I get even with these students who are making my life a living hell?
As the pranks continue, Albert's rage grows.
It upset him because he was OCD and things were not perfect.
There's some things you could have done. You could have gotten a dog, but he didn't do that. He went and bought a gun and became very hyper-vigilant about watching his house and his yard.
Albert's hope is to catch the students vandalizing his house.
He's using those students who are making fun of him as representative of the world not accepting him.
And then Albert sees his chance to get even.
One night, when Albert was patrolling his yard, a young man trespassed in his backyard, and Albert stopped him.
Hey! Stop right there. Why are you on my property?
Albert plans on taking a stand, and he'll use a movie as his guide.
He initially, by gunpoint, ties up this young man. Very similar to what he had witnessed in Deliverance.
Nothing like this had ever happened in our town before. It was about as heinous as a crime can get.
In the thriller Deliverance, 4 city men on a canoe trip in rural Georgia have a terrifying run-in with a couple of locals.
The world created from the movie shows a really backwards town. In some ways, this area has still been trying to shake the film because everybody just judged them like they're all a bunch of hillbillies looking to hurt city people that venture down there.
In Poughkeepsie, New York, middle school teacher Albert Fentress also finds himself being judged by outsiders. He's been the target of pranks all summer, and now it looks like he's finally caught a perpetrator red-handed.
Here's Albert patrolling his yard, defending his property, trying to have some control and autonomy in his house and property. And of course, Albert had his gun, and so the young man stopped.
The man is 18-year-old Paul Masters, a local standout athlete who doesn't attend Albert's school.
Hey, stop right there.
Fentress questioned why Paul was there. Paul explained that he was there because there had been a group that was originally going to fight. My understanding is that the fight of the larger groups never materialized, that the police got wind of it before it escalated.
I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to bother you.
Paul tells Albert that he means him no harm and is simply trying to avoid being arrested.
I'll get out of your hair.
My understanding is that when Paul explained that he was trying not to get caught by the police, Albert Fentress's demeanor changed. Fentress realized that Paul wasn't there to do any harm to him. Fentress then no longer used the gun or needed the gun and didn't display it.
No, wait. Stop, I'm sorry. I'm Albert. Oh, nice to meet you, Paul.
And he invited Paul to come in until the police cleared out of the area.
Paul believes it's the best way to avoid trouble.
Yeah. Good. You okay? Yeah.
But he has no idea what kind of evil lurks inside.
Paul happened to come into this circumstance and truly was the wrong place, wrong time. HBO at that time was showing movies. They were showing R-rated movies that involved content that was not part of what we would think of as regular mainstream broadcasting.
Albert Fentress decides to watch one of the most talked about movies of the 1970s.
Albert Fentress saw the movie Deliverance.
He is immediately shell-shocked by the film.
If you watch that movie, it's a very graphic sexual scene. You didn't see that coming in the movie, this homosexual rape. And so that was, for anybody who saw it, it was jarring.
Like most viewers, Albert can't seem to get the images from Deliverance out of his head.
Albert finished the movie, and then he sat down because he was so disturbed by what he saw. It had created such a mixture of emotions that he had to get it down on paper.
Over the next few days after viewing the movie, he actually found himself writing out scripts that involved homosexual acts.
And after he had written it, he was so shocked at what he had put down on paper that he destroyed it. He burned it because he couldn't handle it.
The movie seems to unlock something buried deep inside Albert's psyche.
When Albert saw the hillbillies seeking revenge by their rape, that was so raw to Albert because he had never seen such raw sexuality.
That triggered, these extreme thoughts that he had.
The fact that he was attracted to men was to not deal with it, was to keep it buried somewhere and try to attempt to be attracted to women. We're talking about 1970s. There was no discussion of individuals having rights. Homosexuality was something one could be arrested for.
The movie speaks to Albert's fragile mental state.
When he saw Deliverance, something inside him opened his eyes. One, there's the men from the city who he identified with, who he had spent his whole life trying to be. Educated, sharp dresser, sophisticated. On the other hand, he saw these men who were ignorant, uneducated, referred to as rednecks or hillbillies, that he also felt was actually him, the outsider, the person who didn't fit in.
Groovy house.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Please, have a seat.
18-year-old Paul Masters is about to find out just how confused Albert Fentress truly is.
And this was a very handsome young man, a young man who had a very nice physique, who had played football. And Albert asked him if he wanted to come inside.
There you go. You are 18, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, there you go.
Before Albert Fentress offered Paul Masters any alcohol, he first actually checked to find out how old Paul was to make sure that he was of drinking age, because back then the drinking age was 18.
So, what happened out there?
The cops came and everybody ran.
They made small talk over the course of 15, 20 minutes while the police cars left the area. Once they sat and chatted for a while, Paul realized that he needed to find a way home. He lived probably 5 or 6 miles from where Fentress lived. Paul realized that his ride had left, so Albert Fentress offers to give Paul a ride home.
It's getting late. I should get going.
Oh, of course.
But Albert has no intentions of letting Paul leave.
He found himself attracted to Paul, and he hated himself for having those feelings.
Everything that I ever learned about Paul Masters is that he was just a great kid who had a bright future ahead of him.
You know, it's been a real pleasure having you.
Albert asks Paul if he can help him move some things in the basement.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
So long as it's quick.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
He can only surmise that Paul agreed to help because he didn't perceive that there was anything that was going to be dangerous to him.
Inside the house, everything suddenly changes.
Albert, who had been watching Deliverance, and then writing out his thoughts and feelings on paper, and then talking to this young man, who then pulled all these feelings and desires from him that he still could not deal with. He broke. He broke.
It's just those things in the corner. You think you can move them over to the door for me?
Yeah, sure thing.
Thank you.
I believe that the combination of viewing the movie, coupled with the pranks that had been occurring over a period of time, kind of brought everything to a head or bubbled up into what became the events of August 19th and 20th. According to Albert Fentress, he goes into a psychotic state. He didn't have a conscious idea of what was going on. He starts to realize that he has the opportunity to act out the script that he has been writing over the last several days, and in fact starts to play it out.
Albert's sexuality, in many ways, was awakened. His repressed feelings. He became angry with Paul for stirring those emotions in him. The anger is based on lust and revenge and rape. All the feelings and emotions that he experienced by watching Deliverance.
In Deliverance, the locals have all the power as they tie John Voight's character to a tree, forcing him to witness his friend's attack.
This too?
Yes, that's fine.
But what Albert's written in his script is far worse, and Paul Masters is about to become his leading man.
Mr. Fentress, what are you doing?
Shut up!
In the 1972 film Deliverance, power holds the key to survival. When four friends from Atlanta venture out of the city and into Georgia's backwoods, they soon realize they're no longer in control.
In the beginning of the film, the city boys look down on the locals. They're just dumb, poor hillbillies to them. Using their guns, what the locals wanted was to strip the friends of any power or control that they thought that they had by shaming and humiliating the men who entered their territory.
Following a viewing of the movie Deliverance, teacher Albert Fentress has an awakening when he catches Paul Masters trespassing on his property.
The movie was very emotionally painful for Albert. He didn't want to deal with his homosexuality. He didn't want to deal with what the movie Deliverance caused inside of him, which probably was a great deal of anger and rage.
After months of being picked on and ridiculed by his students, Albert now finds himself in a position of power.
If you're attracted to someone and they're accepting your invitation to come into your home, you might want to believe that this person is truly interested in you for sexual contact. But this young man wasn't. And here he has the object of his lust that is causing these feelings. And so what does Albert do? He wants to destroy the object of his affections.
18-year-old Paul Masters has no idea what Albert Fentress is capable of.
Mr. Fentress, what are you doing?
Shut up!
Mr. Fentress.
Don't you move. You stay there. Shut up. Just shut up. Get up.
It was all about power and control and male dominance.
You know what I want. God, you stay right there. Put your hands behind your back and you don't move. Put them behind your back. Don't you move. Don't you move. Shut up. Just stay there.
Like John Voight's character in Deliverance, Paul is tied up so he can't escape.
Paul didn't attempt to fight back, I would assume because there was a gun, pointed at him.
You're all mine now. You're not going anywhere. Do you understand me?
Albert wants to turn his own violent script into reality, his deepest, darkest fantasies brought to life.
In his mind, you're not going to leave my house. I'm going to have you. And I'm going to have you against your will. Very similar to what he had witnessed in Deliverance.
I don't know what you think is going on, please. No.
Stop.
Acting out his script, Albert begins to sexually assault Paul Masters.
The script called for Albert Fentress to then engage in sexual acts on his victim, in this case, Paul. Albert pulled Paul's pants down and attempted to perform fellatio on him.
No! No!
But Paul's physical reaction was not like the script because Paul did not become aroused.
Somehow, in Albert's fantasy, he thought this young man, by tying him up, he would be aroused. But fantasies seldom work in reality. And this also makes Albert angry.
I said stop!
But he doesn't get angry at himself. He gets angry at his victim. The only solution from such a narcissistic personality was to then try to control and destroy the object that had caused him so much pain.
Then Albert makes sure Paul stays silent forever.
The idea was Paul could not live. He couldn't live in Albert's world. There wasn't a place for Paul to go on living without, in Albert's mind, destroying his world.
With Paul dead, Albert continues to live out his sordid fantasy.
It was in part playing out the script that he had written.
And then Albert conducts the final act of his script.
He performs cannibalism to keep his attraction deep inside him.
Once he goes up into the kitchen, he actually puts oil in a frying pan and he cooks up the body parts by sauteing them.
But then Albert is startled. Although Paul is critically wounded, he is still alive.
Albert is still in the psychotic state, and in that state, he was just looking to continue to follow through on the script.
And the script says Paul Masters needs to die. After the shooting, Albert begins to put his life back in order as if nothing ever happened.
Albert Fentress had backed his car into the garage with the thought that he was going to dispose of the body by putting it in the trunk of his car and removing it from the scene.
But Albert soon realizes getting rid of a body is not as easy as the movies make it seem.
Deliverance, they were trying to hide a body with 4 men, and Albert was trying to hide a body by himself. Very different. And again, reality is very different than fantasy. Reality is very different than a movie.
Albert needs to get rid of Paul's body and fast. For all he knows, someone saw Paul in his yard and the police are on their way.
He was attempting to move the body. He realizes in the moment that something horrible has happened and that he's the person who's done it. He comes to that realization.
But what Albert does next is truly unexplainable. In the movie Deliverance, just when it seems there's no hope for the men under attack, Burt Reynolds arrives and takes care of business.
Burt Reynolds shows up and kills the attacker with an arrow, and then the other local runs off. Power is regained through violence.
In Poughkeepsie, New York, Albert Fentress watched Deliverance 2 days before killing 18-year-old Paul Masters in cold blood.
Watching the movie Deliverance affected him profoundly because there was so much there that he identified with and related to, but couldn't emotionally deal with.
According to Albert, the murder occurred while he was in a psychotic state. But once he begins to move Paul's body, reality sets in.
He describes it as almost as if he awoke from the psychotic state. He realizes in the moment that something horrible has happened and that he's the person who's done it.
When he realized what he had done, he did call a friend and told him everything and wanted to know what he should do next in terms of letting the authorities know.
The friend was concerned enough about how Albert was acting that he took it upon himself to then call someone more local to get there sooner. The phone call was placed to the City of Poughkeepsie Police. The dispatcher received that and then dispatched uniformed officers to Albert Fentress's house.
The police get to Albert's house at 3:15 a.m. that morning.
Door's open. Fentress! Hello? Fentress! Fentress!
When the police arrive, Albert has the gun.
Are you armed?
And for whatever reason, he will not come to the door to greet the police, but he remains sitting in a living room chair with the gun.
I said, are you armed?
Yes.
Where's the gun?
On the chair. Please take it.
Put your hands up.
Hands up! Hands behind your head! Get to the ground now! To the ground!
He told them that he had killed someone and that he had done something terrible.
Down on the ground.
There's someone in the basement.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law.
The first responders have no idea the amount of carnage that looms ahead.
This was an undescribable crime. No one had ever seen or heard of anything as atrocious as this. It was such a horrific scene, and there was blood everywhere.
Albert discloses all the gory details of what transpired in his home.
Albert Fentress admitted that he had cooked and eaten the body parts.
Certainly, this crime was way off the charts for the community in every sense of it. I don't think the police ever had a cannibalism case in Poughkeepsie in the whole time they've been there, so I think it was new for everybody.
Albert is immediately arrested.
He was sent to a facility 40, 50 miles from where the crime happened. There were only a few facilities in the state that were equipped to handle him.
Albert's lawyers enter a not guilty plea by reason of insanity.
They said that Albert Fentress, at the time, was suffering from a mental disease or defect that rendered him incapable of understanding what he was doing was wrong.
And then there's the movie Deliverance.
He had had these horrible thoughts after seeing the movie Deliverance.
In Albert's mind, the movie affected him very much. On some levels, it also, I think, kindled certain interests he had as it related to his suppressed homosexual tendencies and feelings. Based upon the writings that he created and ultimately the acts that played out, it definitely had a great impact on him.
Ultimately, Albert is found not guilty by reason of insanity.
I believe that the pranking, the fear of possibly being labeled homosexual were all taken into account by the psychiatrists and the psychologists as they were doing their diagnoses.
It's a favorable sentence that might just allow Albert to re-enter society once more.
The process actually begins with a review after 6 months of being confined. Then it's a review every 2 years. I believe that Albert Fentress recognized that if at some time in the future he presented as being no longer mentally ill and no longer dangerous, that he then may be allowed to return to the community.
And like the movie, there is another shocking twist in store. For Paul might not be the only victim of Albert Fentress, and there's a chance he could be set free to kill again.
In 1999, we had the rehearing and they determined that he was no longer dangerous.
At the end of the film Deliverance, the surviving friends manipulate their homicidal story in order to avoid criminal charges and possible time behind bars.
The decision to cover up the crime comes from a place of fear. The men believe that the locals would protect themselves, and so if they're in front of a jury of these locals having killed a local, it's not going to play well for them.
As for former teacher turned killer Albert Fentress, the details of his horrific and brutal copycat crime earn him an insanity plea and the possibility of rejoining society.
He was placed in Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center, which is in the Middletown, New York area.
Okay, Mr. Fentress, you're all set.
Throughout his time at the psychiatric center, Albert is a model patient. Almost 20 years later, the 57-year-old claims he's cured from the momentary insanity that caused him to kill Paul Masters.
The law provides that every 2 years, Albert Fentress is eligible to have his mental status reviewed and determine whether he is still mentally ill and or whether he is considered dangerous.
It's reasonable to assume that after 19 years of therapy, that anything that Albert had kept buried inside, he had, in a supportive environment, been able to release, that he had accepted his repressed homosexuality.
In 1999, we had the rehearing and review, which was in front of a jury, and all the experts that had testified within the recent past testified. The jury, in their findings, came back and found that he was mentally ill, but they determined that he was no longer dangerous.
But just as Albert thinks he's going to be walking free,
Albert Fentress?
New information comes to light.
You need to come with us.
Yes, sir. 2 men came forward to report that when they had been children, Albert had abused them.
One of the victims claim Albert assaulted him after school and then threatened to keep him quiet.
Not you, Bobby. Hold on. Could you hang out for a minute?
Okay, Mr. Fentress. What's up?
Bobby, I like you.
The victim likely stayed silent for so long out of fear and embarrassment.
Once these young men came forward, Albert Fentress withdrew any request for release. He was actually then placed back into a secure facility where he remains to date. I'm not sure why they didn't come forward before. I can only surmise that as there was a possibility that he could be released, that they were fearful that that could happen.
In a bizarre twist of fate, Albert's former student, Wayne Witherwax, is assigned to the ongoing parole review process.
I became directly involved with the case in 1992. I volunteered to take over the case because of my personal connections to it. This case is not over still because the law provides that every 2 years, Albert Fentress is eligible to have his mental status reviewed and determine whether he is still mentally ill and or whether he is considered dangerous.
He still suffers from the mental illness that he suffered from in 1979.
Around Poughkeepsie, New York, residents are still plagued by haunting memories of Albert's hideous crime.
It was just tragic because Paul had nothing to do with anything in his life. There was absolutely no connection. It was totally random. All that sort of contributed to the horror of the crime.
It was just a horrific crime that no one could fathom. The thought that someone could do that to another human being is just beyond anyone's imagination.
It's a copycat killing that, like the movie it's inspired by, will never be forgotten.
Albert was a very, very disturbed individual who tried to control every move he made. In the end, he broke. Sometimes we say it's only a movie, but I can assure you, a movie that we identify with can have profound effects in how we proceed in our lives.